Welcome to this week's episode of Active Measures. This week, Olga and I are discussing our column from yesterday about the Kremlin troll farm. And for those of you who followed the 2016 election, you're probably very familiar with the fact that the Russians did everything they could in very many different ways. But one of the most important ways that they used and utilized their ability to infiltrate our election is that they used effectively our free speech against us. They had a troll farm that was first outside St. Petersburg and then became so popular that it moved inside St. Petersburg, where hundreds and hundreds of people worked 12-hour shifts at a time to simulate Americans and to effectively divide our country. Some were Black Lives Matter posing as Black Lives Matter activists. Others were posing as Blue Lives Matter activists. Some were going after Hillary and amplifying all sorts of crazy conspiracy theories. Some were posing as Bernie bros. Remember the Bernie bros that everybody was so offended about online? Well, a lot of them were Russian. And so everything possible to divide us, everything possible to go after Hillary Clinton, everything possible to elevate Donald Trump. And Olga, I want to talk to you not so much about what we wrote in our column, because that, of course, is something people can read themselves. And if you haven't read it, I urge you to go to either my Substack, Salty Politics, or to Olga's Substack, I'm Asking Russia, and read our entire Active Measures series, but specifically the one that we're talking about today, the Kremlin troll farm. But I want to talk to you more about how this behavior continues um, today and how, of course, the United States, which once used to combat this kind of behavior, is now actively doing everything possible to allow Russia to continue doing that. So why don't you go ahead and let's talk about that?
Sorry. Hi, everyone. So, yeah, since Trump came back to office, I mean, he's done every single thing to leave America vulnerable, from dismantling foreign election task force to dismantling, um, hey, call the anti-disinformation efforts to combat disinformation efforts. I mean, everything. He really is intentionally leaving us open for election attacks for these disinformation operations. And in the latest move, the State Department basically announced that they're cutting the pacts with our European allies in order, you know, to again undermine Europe and at the same time endanger us. And what we did was we worked closely with the Europeans to monitor any kind of, emerging disinformation operations and to basically put ideas together on how to counter it. And now Trump, as with everything else where he sees Europe as our enemy, Russia is our friend, he handed Russia another gift to, with this latest move.
Yeah, and I want to talk a little bit about that because it started even before Trump's second term. In Biden's term, they set up something in the Department of Homeland Security that effectively was going to combat disinformation. And by combating disinformation, it was truly going to go after these kinds of trolls and go after foreign interference in social media that really gets into people's mind perniciously. And I would just urge people, again, if you see stuff on Twitter or Blue Sky or Substack or wherever you happen to YouTube, wherever you happen to be, from people that you don't know, that are kind of pushing the same message over and over again, make an assumption that these are not people who exist as the people who they are. They're most likely trolls. And they're most likely trolls potentially paid for by the Russians or the Chinese or whoever else. I don't know as much about the Chinese efforts as we do about the Russian efforts. But during the Biden administration, they did set up an office in the Department of Homeland Security to combat all of this. And it was run by a woman named Nina Jankowicz, who we should have on the show one day because she's fantastic. Well, that lasted about 2 milliseconds because the Republicans went crazy and said that this is the Biden administration's attempt to censor free speech, and this is anti-free speech, and you're going to censor our viewpoints, and you're going to effectively have Big Brother come after us, and this is anti-First Amendment. And Fox News went so nuts on this that literally, I think they mentioned Nina Jankowicz's name. I don't know how many times. She was pregnant. Um, and she was almost 9 months pregnant, or actually, she was 9 months pregnant. She was about to give birth. She effectively had to barricade her door because there were people who were literally out to murder her because of what Fox did and because of what Republicans did. Well, long story short, the Biden administration disgracefully threw her under the bus and got rid of this office and kind of left her to fend for herself. But what I think is fascinating about the story, in addition to how she was treated, is that Biden caved. Biden caved because Republicans had a very concerted effort with right wing media, but also online and everywhere else to gin up this whole notion that this was censorship and this was anti First Amendment. I would bet any amount of money, and of course we don't know because nobody's done the research that this office would have done otherwise to prove that this emanated from Russia in order to get Russia to effectively continue their assault on social media, in order to get Russia to unimpeded say whatever it wants about our elections, in order to gin up the base for Trump or whoever they want to gin it up for, or more importantly, to sow division in the United States. And of course, we know this because of what we wrote last week. This right wing media. It's not a coincidence that we first wrote about right wing media and then wrote about the social media aspect of this, because the jump always happens, right? It starts on
Yeah.
social media by Russian bots, and then it jumps to places like Fox. And then the next thing you know, Republicans on the Hill are going crazy, subpoenaing people like Nina Jankowicz to come testify. And Biden and the administration get scared because they don't want to be accused of censorship or First Amendment and get rid of the whole thing, which of course then does exactly what Russia wanted. Now Russia, unimpeded, can continue this kind of behavior. And to say that everybody in this scenario was a Russian useful idiot, it breaks my heart to say from Joe Biden on down. In this case, they were. And that's something that is very important for people to recognize. And so I just think, as much as, I used to get into Twitter fights all the time. When I was at Fox, I actually had a TV show called The Clap Back, where I would literally clap back at Twitter trolls. I don't do that anymore because I know that 80% of them, 20% of them are guys sitting in, their basement somewhere in their underwear, but a large number of them are people who are either in St. Petersburg or wherever they happen to be, who are looking for a fight and looking to gin up controversy. And of course, the algorithm rewards that, which is why if you don't respond, you're kind of suppressed on Twitter on the algorithm. But that's the world we live in. And we gotta understand that. And if you read our column from yesterday, you'll understand exactly what they did, how pernicious they were in getting it done.
Yeah, and this far right, and it's specifically the extremist far right. This attack on, a that their free speech is being taken away, which frankly, there's like a line between what is free speech and if you're pushing propaganda on the payroll of a foreign intelligence service, as we found out with several far right influencers. Um, this effort has been ongoing for several years, and it's actually like really extremely troubling because these far right groups have gotten together, and it's not as much that they have a case, but they've gotten together and they went after Stanford, which ended up shutting down their disinformation operations. They went after think tanks, people that I know who combat disinformation, which again, by the time it reaches a court, it might very well be thrown out. But in the process, you actually have to spend money for to prepare the legal work, and to put together a defense. So I mean, the goal was more to intimidate through lawfare, which is pretty much how Russia operates around the globe, where they go after journalists, and they know that the case will get thrown out, but they use lawfare in order, one, to intimidate, because they'll you know, prevent other journalists from looking into corrupt oligarchs or into Kremlin operations because they don't want to be dragged through court. Um, and this has been ongoing for quite a few years, and it's extremely troubling. And you know what is more troubling? So we have, Trump exiting these pacts with Europe, which fine, whatever. We know that he would do this. This is whatever. But he's using our tax funded agencies, the State Department, and other agencies to go after Europe, who's trying to get their act together with their digital act and, to try to counter disinformation from China, Iran, Russia, North Korea. He's going after them, threatening, tariffs, threatening visa bans. I mean, every other day that I document in my tracker, there's another attack over this digital act that they, are strengthening right now because Europe, over the past few years, realized the importance of countering disinformation. And they're going after them using our tax funded agencies and tools, that normally you would use for Iran or Russia. I mean, when have we banned Europeans for actually wanting to protect their information space and their homeland? And this is what we're doing right now. So it's even worse. One thing is, for US to completely exit. The other thing is to threaten Europe that they need to do this. And if they don't, they're going to feel the full force of US tools, whether it's sanctions. That was the other one. They threatened to sanction people involved in the crafting this digital act. I mean, this is what you do again. The US would do this to Iran, to China, to Russia, not to our allies or former allies. So this is where it gets even more dangerous. And people really need to understand. You made a good point not to answer. People also need to kind of use social media with control because Russian disinformation operations are meant to evoke an emotion because this is how their military intelligence services work, where they know how to like the triggers to use in order to have someone rage or be depressed or feel they're under attack with their rights or whatnot. So when you see very provocative stories being spread, and immediately have that emotion of, some kind of negative emotion, take a step back and actually verify it before sharing, before responding, before anything. I mean, with Trump these days, unfortunately, a lot of the actions he's doing um, you know, does evoke these emotions, but as these influencers and these anonymous accounts, because they run in operations, and there's, tens and tens of millions of them, take a step back and, verify anything before sharing, check multiple sources, check. I can't tell you how many times I get stuck seeing something and then I see it in very strange papers, but nothing from any credible outlet.
Yeah.
Because Russia also at the same time has, beside the bots and trolls, they have tens of thousands of media outlets that are meant to look like mirror actual outlets. So also at the same time, pause because we saw this during the election where they used a local San Francisco outlet, a mirror of it. And I started digging into it, and it was actually registered in Iceland in August of 24. And they used this to spread a fake AI video that this woman, who's an AI bot, claimed that when she was younger, about a decade or so ago, that Kamala Harris, ran her over and left the scene of the accident. And this video, I can't tell you how many tens of millions of views it had, and it was coming from something that resembled the local San Francisco station. And then when you actually went and started digging into this, you saw that one, there's absolutely no accident. There's no woman that this, a mirror of a San Francisco station was registered in Iceland, which is where Russia registers a lot of its fake news sites and whatnot. And again, this spread like wildfire, and many people could have, like, seen it come across and be like, oh, wow, Harris was involved in a hit and run accident a decade ago, and then start repeating this information. So Russia's also getting extremely more sophisticated with this, and that's why it's even more important for all of us to take that step, not to react, but to actually analyze, look into it, verify, and then if you see it's credible, then you can do whatever you want with the information.
Yeah, and I think, one of the reasons, Olga, that whenever I write my Substack columns, I literally, I would write them a lot faster if I didn't link, and I know you have the same thing, didn't link to sources. Like, I always have primary sources that I link to with every allegation that I make or any assertion that I make, because it's important. It's important for people to get the facts for themselves. It's not that you're just taking my word for it. Here is the data that I'm basing this on. And I think it's very important, because if you don't do that, then you're taking somebody's word for it. For all you know, they have been set up for a year or two or three or four to get you engaged with them, to become a trusted voice. And all of a sudden, then you realize they may be Russian bots. I remember when I was, again, and going back to my Fox days, because that was in 2016, 2015, 2016, when this troll fire was very, very active, the Internet Research Agency, which is the name of this troll farms. Um, there was something called, I think the account was 10Gen. Is that right? Tennessee
Yeah.
something.
Hmm.
Um, they were uh, so prolific, so prolific. And every time I would say anything anti-Trump, they would come after me nonstop and over and over and over again. And not just me, everybody. And they looked like they were a bunch of, I think maybe it was 10 GOP or something, but they were basically this pretending to be this Tennessee GOP, almost like
Yeah,
the Republican State Committee of
that's what it
Tennessee.
was, 10_GOP.
That's what it was, 10 GOP. And at first I was like 10 GOP. I thought it was the number 10. It turns out they were trying to emulate the Tennessee GOP. Turns out they were one of the preeminent IRA bots. They were operating out of a St. Petersburg um, warehouse somewhere. And sometimes it was very obvious. Sometimes their English, not this particular account, but sometimes their English, of course, if you speak Russian like Olga and I do, you can kind of understand where somebody's English may be in writing fluent, but you understand the phraseology may not be quite right. Somehow they're not, their verbs and their nouns are not quite American. So sometimes it'd be pretty obvious, and sometimes I'd respond and just say, "Hey, it's a little late in St. Petersburg today. Why are you still up trolling me?"
At least
And
you're nice.
immediately they would stop. They would stop, which says to me that obviously the instructions were, if you're somehow identified, then just stop,
Move
disengage
on.
altogether, so that move on, move on, move on, move on. And
At
they did.
least you're nice. Because I
Yeah. No,
used to
no, I was
answer
like,
them
I mean,
and
I would literally retweet it and be like, in Russian, like, "Isn't it a little late for you and your
and
in your
I would in
warehouse?"
Russian be like, "Oh, okay, иди нахуй,
Yeah, well,
whoever."
yeah.
Sorry.
I was raised nicer
That
than that, to curse out somebody and drop the N-word on them, but but,
that's how I would answer.
yeah,
They would
but
buzz
if you
off.
yeah, but if you call them out, they would go away. But, and the same continues, but as Olga pointed out, now it's become much more sophisticated. They know they can't just do
Yeah.
it online, so what they do is they emulate newspapers that sound sort of legit. So, it's not the Boston Globe, and I'm totally making this up, so I apologize if this newspaper exists in real life because I'm just pulling this out of my head, but it wouldn't be the Boston Globe, it would be like the Boston Monitor or something, right? Things that sound close enough. And that's where they come from. I mean, that is literally what they do, and you don't know, if you don't live in Boston, that this newspaper doesn't exist, right? So you just put it out there. And that's a problem. I mean, that's a big problem because people don't know. So, you know, even if it looks legit, really do your research before you engage.
Can
And
I give you?
sorry, just one
Go
more
ahead,
thing.
finish.
It may be that they're anti-Trump because they know that's what appeals to you. They don't really care. They're all about sowing dissent. So it's not really a question of like there's no election right now. In 28, I'm sure if JD Vance is on the ballot, they'll go all in for Vance. But right now, it's just all about creating chaos and dissent in the country, regardless of where you are.
Just wanted to give an example in 2017, because I work on information operations and warfare for, a long, long time, over a decade now, since Russia invaded Ukraine and perfected these tactics in Ukraine before unleashing it at everyone. And in 2017, I remember seeing Guardian article. This was the most fascinating thing because this was literally the precursor to Russia's, then infamous doppelganger operations that they've pretty much with this mirroring of sites. So I was on Twitter and I am scrolling and I see a Guardian article and it had, I believe it was the former MI6 chief, his face. So of course I got curious. I'm like, oh, let me read this article. I read it, and because I know Russia enough, I was like, what is this? This looks like KGB garbage. So I'm like, why would the Guardian write this? So this is another thing. If you are used to reading your wherever you get your news and you see any kind of tone and shift or something, shift in tone or something like this, look into it. So I read The Guardian all the time. So I'm like, this really looks like KGB propaganda. I mean, it was really going after in very subtle tones against MI6 and going after European security. And I actually screenshotted and tweeted about it and notified The Guardian that this was happening. So you're on this article, and then on top it says The Guardian. I click on the Guardian link, and it takes you to the Guardian homepage, which is, okay. I start looking for this article. It's not on the homepage. So I copy, go back, copy this title of the article, do a Google search. There is no such article. So somehow at that time in 17, when Russia was testing this doppelganger, operation, because they're constantly advancing in their information operations, somehow they made this article like a mirror of article link back to the Guardian. But then if you went to the Guardian, no such article existed. If you search Google, no such article existed. Like, it was just if you happened to click on that link that you would hit the article. And this was, again, 2017. You could just imagine now with AI and deepfakes, the sophistication that they've
Yeah.
developed. So that's why it's so important, even if you're reading the New York Times or Washington Post or Wall Street Journal. I mean, for the most part, you know the tone, of the articles. And if you see something seems very off, also take that extra step to Google and see if the New York Times actually wrote that article or if this is some kind of a fake mirror, of a New York Times article.
Yeah, and I think that's important to note because the problem that we're living with right now is that with AI, it is so easy to effectively, as Olga said, to be a doppelganger for anybody, to even write in the tone of that newspaper, right? Because the Times has a very different way of writing than the New York Post, for instance, or a tabloid, or um, and it's not hard to do with AI. And so the rise of AI is going to make this problem even more pernicious. It's going to make this problem even more widespread. And what we saw in 15, 16, a decade ago, is like child's play compared to what we're going to see in 26 and 28. And so I
But
think yeah, go ahead. But
no, go ahead, finish and
yeah,
then but.
well, just something to bear in mind because,
I do have a positive because I have become best friends with Grok. And as dangerous as AI can be, it's actually an amazing fact checking tool because every time now I see disinformation on Twitter and I'm in one of my feisty combative moods, I go into these, propagandist influencer sites and write at Grok, is this true? And then like literally you'll see under their post a fact check version that this is not true. So
yeah.
at the same time, we could use, technology to combat this quicker and have that footprint, under. That way, when people click into one of these, influencers' tweet, on the bottom, like the first tweet they'll see is that Grok is basically debunking propaganda. So this is something until AI hopefully won't get, twisted or hijacked by Russia, or China. But for now, this is something AI can actually be very useful because you can literally debunk in real time without actually having to go do the research
Yeah,
of,
and don't
finding.
forget, and sorry, Olga, go ahead.
No,
Yeah,
nothing.
don't forget that as media is shrinking, legitimate media is shrinking, and I would say legacy media is shrinking, you have the rise of independent media, which the Russians will get to eventually. So we're doing this on Substack now. I don't know if anybody from, Russia is on Substack now. They will be here eventually because there's
They
too
are.
much opportunity here, right? Um, I don't know how much they're on YouTube, but I suspect a lot. They will be on all the independent media channels you could think about. And if you are somebody who spends a lot of time on Substack and getting your news from Substack, you kind of trust the platform to be the platform that delivers the news to you. And that's what they want. They want you to get comfortable with the platform and then they'll move forward with it. And so, again, just as a word of warning, and again, I don't think we wanted to necessarily rehash the column that we wrote because you could read it. It's very long, so we don't need to rehash it here. But read that column and then think about what we're saying here, which is that we are very much at a time where they are trying very hard to do everything possible to change American public opinion. It's not enough to divide us now. They're also looking to change American public opinion with respect to whom we elect, so that if we elect people who are Russia friendly, they'll probably be in a much better shape. They don't need to change our opinion on the war in Ukraine. They don't need to change our opinion on sanctions. They just need to get us to vote for people who are going to do what they want. JD Vance is like their wet dream. And if they can get him elected in 28, assuming Trump ever leaves, I have doubts. That's going to be the best coup. That's going to be better than Trump for them. By a smidge, because Trump is pretty good. So, just think about that. But Trump is unstable, so that's a little bit probably concerning to them. And the problem is that, and they're trying to divide us from our enemies. So suddenly Canada has become our enemy. Suddenly Denmark has become our enemy, right? Well, what do those two countries have in common? They're both in NATO. What do the Russians want to do? Get rid of NATO. But suddenly on Twitter and on social media, you see this whole push to annex Greenland, this whole push to make Canada the 51st state. That's not an accident. That's not an accident. And as much as they are doing that right now, understand they have now taken, look, just in the last 2 days, in the last day, there's been two huge announcements. One is a Trumper has basically been placed in charge of standards at CBS News after David Ellison purchased Paramount, which owns CBS, which means that CBS News, the home of Walter Cronkite, is now going to effectively be a megaphone for Trump and therefore a megaphone for Russia. I don't know that 60 Minutes is going to go in that direction. I don't know what's going to happen to shows like that. But that is what we're gearing up for. At the
Yep.
same time, I don't know if people know, the Murdoch family, which owns Fox News, has been in a very, very, very high profile fight for the future of the company. Well, that fight was over yesterday, and Rupert Murdoch's chosen successor, Lachlan Murdoch, won, which means that they have now solidified the tilt of Fox News for the next generation at least. And what that means is that as long as Fox News is around, and again, linear television is dying, but they have a very strong digital presence as well, they are now going to continue on this path of dividing America and spewing pro-Trump and therefore pro-Russian information. Things are not going in a great direction for all that Republicans keep talking about the left-wing media. Things are not going in a great direction for media that was never left-wing. It just told the truth, right? Like, what's that famous line? Truth is a famous liberal bias because it's the truth. But that doesn't exist anymore. So I think, Olga, on that note, we've been at it for about 40 minutes. Anything else you want to add?
I'll just add that, with all this, how Russia is advancing and Iran and China and everyone, doing everything to divide us. I mean, it really is up to us. And we can actually correct this because, frankly, when Estonia, over a decade, I mean, they were the first ones to get hit with these information operations in 2007. The Estonian government made it, part of their national security defense. And I mean, literally, every single person had to undergo critical thinking and fact checking and everything. I think, being that obviously our government is opposite of that, they want to erase the fact checking capability. It is up to us. And we can take these extra steps to, develop critical thinking, use the critical thinking, not to react with emotion. And we're constantly, and this is the thing that I see with the democratic resistance here, and prior to that too, the US, we're constantly in this defense mode. And we really need to reverse the thinking and start going on the offense. And I mean, if St. Petersburg, when you read our article, employed whatever, say 10,000 troops, there's 300 million of us. And even say 75 million of us actually take the steps to fact check, to spread proper information, to show sources to people. If someone around you, your family member or your colleague at work, says something that's, fake news, tell them, oh, actually, no, that isn't here. Let me send you 5 articles that show that this is really happening. So, I mean, we can create our own troll army of truth and push back against this and not wait for the government. So that's my, on a positive note, ending.
Yep. So, couple of updates for you. One, um, there's still time to sign up for Olga's and my seminar on disinformation, which starts on September 17th in a week. It is at 3 p.m. every Wednesday, Olga.
Yes.
And you can still sign up. It's for paid subscribers to either Olga's or my Substack. You don't have to do both. It'd be great if you could, but if not, just sign up for either of our two Substacks and you can participate in that. We will be back tomorrow for another episode of Pax Americana at 11 a.m. Eastern. And we will be back on Monday with another chapter in our series on active measures, which is what this is about, on Monday morning in your inbox on Substack. And then we'll see you again to discuss that chapter next Tuesday at 12:30 Eastern, right back here on Substack. So we have a lot going on. Thank you guys for joining. Over 500 people have now joined us in the middle of the day here in the United States. We are just incredibly grateful and blown away by just the huge community that we're building. Thank you so much. And we will see you all soon. Bye,
Yes.
everybody.
Bye,
Bye.
everyone.